How far will the Chinese Communist Party go to tell a lie? Welcome back to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. The Chinese Communist Party officials are masters of propaganda. Just look at how they tried to change the narrative about the coronavirus. It didn't begin in China. It was spread by the US military. Peaceful protests in Hong Kong against the Chinese Communist Party? No, they're violent riots with signs of terrorism. More than 1 million Uyghur Muslims locked up in concentration camps in Xinjiang? It's not genocide, it's counterterrorism. The Communist Party has been perfecting its propaganda machine for decades, and one of its biggest successes was with Falun Gong. Since 1999, the Chinese Communist Party has waged a brutal persecution against the Falun Gong spiritual movement. The reasons for that are complex. For background, check out my episode, What is Falun Gong and Why is it Persecuted? So, the Chinese regime tried to paint Falun Gong as a dangerous cult. It's not a persecution, it's China's way of protecting human rights. But at first, most people found that hard to swallow, until this. On January 23, 2001, it appeared that a group of Falun Gong practitioners came to Tiananmen Square and set themselves on fire. That became known as the Tiananmen Square Self-Immolation incident. It was broadcast repeatedly on state television, and it completely changed the narrative on Falun Gong. Except some people think the entire thing was faked. Joining me today to talk about this is Jason Loftus. He's the co-director of an upcoming documentary about the Tiananmen Square self-immolation called Ask No Questions. Thanks for joining me today, Jason.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. So I'm guessing a lot of people outside of China probably have never heard of the Tiananmen Square self-immolation. What made you want to put it back into the spotlight?
Yeah, I get into that a little bit in the film. I approached the story from the inside. I had come across Falun Gong in 1998, prior to there being any crackdown on Falun Gong in China or any of the sort of hostility from the Chinese government. And because of that, I was kind of thrust into the whole human rights cause because I had connected with Falun Gong. I had my own experience with it, and then all of a sudden in China, it's banned and it's being, alleged to be behind all kinds of negative things in China. And so I figured from where I was that perhaps I could help to bridge that gap and just share my own experience. The narrative we're hearing doesn't line up with the narrative that I have, and there seems to be some human rights concerns here that I'm hoping that we can address. So that's how I kind of came into the whole story. But I had very little knowledge of Chinese politics or history at that time. I was still in my late teens. I was in high school. And then flash forward a couple of years into this crackdown and this persecution going on in China. And there's all kinds of claims that are more and more difficult for me to really make sense of. And I think the most difficult thing was this self-immolation. These people set themselves on fire. It's alleged to have been as a result of their practice of Falun Gong. And that just completely was at odds with my own experience of the practice, with the people I had met through the practice, with everything I had seen in Falun Gong's teachings. But at the same time, it's very difficult to answer for that. So what happened? If it wasn't this, then what was it? Who's going to set themselves on fire if it's not for this purpose? So I think at first, when it kind of faded from public view, it was a big news story in the West. I remember it being on the front page of a local newspaper when I was I was in university, and quickly it kind of faded from memory. And for me, honestly, on some level, I think I was okay with that because I didn't want people thinking, hey, maybe I'm going to set myself on fire because they heard that I did Falun Gong. Friends and acquaintances and that kind of thing. So from one angle, it's kind of like forgotten, but it's meeting people who are coming out of China, and in particular, people even coming out recently, like the character we meet in this film, Chen Ray Chang, and you realize this wasn't just a passing news story in China. It wasn't something that, came about once and then people forgot about it. It was used continuously in China to turn the public against the Falun Gong group, against the practice. And for Falun Gong adherents in China who had been subjected to imprisonment, they were forced to watch this repeatedly in an effort to have them renounce their faith. So it was really a sort of a key element of the whole anti-Falun Gong campaign. And when I realized the human cost that it was having and continuing to have, I felt that it's something that should be looked at. And, in this film, which we get into, we meet this gentleman who's living in New York now, and his name is Chen Ray Chang, and he worked, as a senior personnel on one of the largest state-run television networks in China. And he's convinced that this incident is a government plot. And just his accusation and knowing that he sort of comes from both worlds as someone who had helped to craft propaganda before, but then as he connects with Falun Gong, he's thrown into, brainwashing centers and labor camps and forced to renounce his beliefs. Just seeing him on both sides of this, it was very interesting. And I wanted to pursue this story and see what we could learn.
Well, speaking of that, your movie has been called as close to Black Mirror as you'll find in nonfiction. So why did you call it Ask No Questions?
Well, yeah, I think there's a couple of, there's the saying, right? It's like it's out of Great Expectations, Dickens, right? It's like ask no questions and you'll be told no lies. I think it even predates that book a bit as well. It's that saying that's been around, and it's the suggestion is this is something that is shrouded in so many layers of information. And to be honest, as soon as you start to dig into this story, there's things that obviously don't add up, but it's a bit of a rabbit hole. You keep going and there's more layers of confusing information to find out what really happened. So it's one of those things. I felt that we're kind of playing on that term or that phrase. And I think the other element of it is it's a difficult thing to probe into. There's incentives definitely not to do it. And that's something that we learn when we speak with the CNN journalist, Lisa Weaver, who was on the square, and her own experience of what she went through. And how she was discouraged from pursuing this story. We speak with other journalists who didn't want to be part of the film, but who intuited how difficult things are in China.
Why did those journalists not want to speak with you?
There's a number of different reasons. Some of them mentioned they have family members in China. Some of them mentioned they still have business interests in China. I think some people on another level too are concerned. I think that the propaganda, in a sense, has also had an impact. I think people feel like there's definite risks of speaking out or of pursuing the story, and at the same time, maybe not much to be gained, because what if you go through this whole journey and you find out that maybe what the government said was true, or maybe there is an issue with this group, then why have I stuck my neck out for them? So it's almost as though in some cases the accusation is enough to dissuade the critical investigation that's needed. I think there's all of that there. And then we get into in the film, there's definite incentives on a business level for journalists and even for myself to not pursue this story.
Well, I know in the documentary you mentioned you faced some harassment over the film.
Yeah, it's after we got through a number of the interviews on it, my wife's family members in China that she had communicated with through on some of the Chinese social media apps, they were contacted by the Public Security Bureau in China. They were told we were told through them that they know what we're up to, and it's just this kind of veiled threat of, we know what you're doing without any specifics. And at the same time, we were in the midst of publishing a video game that we had worked long and hard on, and we had a business deal with Tencent, which is one of the largest media companies in China. They had helped us go through all the government approvals. Two different ministries had given us, the censorship offices had approved our game. It's not about the content, and then all of a sudden, and this is part of the film, part of the story, we're told that they have to cut ties with our business because the government has gone to approach them. So clearly we stepped on some kind of tripwire there, and it's, we were targeted for that. So I could see definitely how businesses, the concerns that people share, like the journalists who say, hey, I'm concerned about my business, that's real. There are real risks to speaking out for sure.
Did you ever figure out how the Public Security Bureau in China knew you were working on this documentary?
Well, you can't determine that for sure because when they contacted our business partners and my wife's family members, they applied pressure in a general way rather than being specific. But we do have some theories about how they were able to gain access to because of the people they contacted. And we knew what Chinese social media tools we were using to communicate with them. I think it's an appropriate reminder for people who are relying on any kind of social media technologies that come out of China that those companies are beholden to Chinese government interests, and information and communications that you have may be visible to those authorities. So our suspicion is that it's coming out of that.
This really is like Black Mirror. So the Communist Party is still trying to cover this up even 20 years later.
For sure. I mean, I think that this is not a subject that they would like people to look at. And I think as you go through the film and you see the journey that we go on journalistically in terms of looking at different angles of what may have happened here, pretty quickly the official narrative, a lot of elements of it fall apart. I think the bigger journey is, well, then what happened and why did it stay hidden for so long? You know, those aspects of it. But the state narrative that was put out there initially doesn't hold a lot of water in my mind. And I think that any discussion around it and looking in that direction is definitely something they would like to discourage.
Well, one of the things I found really interesting about the movie was that you kept digging into this incident and you kept finding more and more mind-blowing things. Can you tell us a little bit about that process?
Yeah, and I think it was important for me because I came to the story with some proximity. I was someone who was, I was part of the Falun Gong community when this whole thing happened, and it was very real for me. And I think for anyone who's in that kind of situation, the tendency can be very easily to just want to validate a kind of preconceived idea. But I think at the same time, you have to be willing to set aside any notion that you come to if you really want to find the answers of what happened in an event, especially in a complicated story like this. So I wanted to just follow things wherever they could. And I also have, a directing partner that I worked with on this project. And I think that was a really helpful process for us because he came to it, Eric Petticelli, he's someone who's worked on a number of human rights films. Black Code was one that dealt with censorship and internet surveillance that had elements of what was going on in China. So he had a human rights background as well, but he came to the story with fresh with the Falun Gong aspect of it. So he came to it from the outside. I came to it being familiar with the story. And it was really important that we just sort of follow things wherever they were and that we debated about the merits of each element that we were coming across case by case. And when you do that, I think there's some really sort of surprising twists and turns that come about. And I don't want to spoil all of that, but it's quite a ride, and that's why people are calling it sort of a real life episode of Black Mirror, or like a crazy trip down the rabbit hole and that kind of thing. That was definitely the journey we went through, spending so much time with this material.
Well, as you mentioned, there were clearly a lot of discrepancies in the story the Chinese Communist Party was telling. It actually changed multiple times. So why didn't Western media do more digging into the story at the time?
That was one of the most interesting questions for me. And I don't think that there's one single answer, because I don't think it's that, every journalist stationed in Beijing is part of some underground conspiracy group where they all take directions on what to cover and what not to cover. I think it's a combination of stories, a combination of reasons, I'm sorry. And one of the things that I think was quite insightful was an interview that our team did with David Satter that appears in the film. And he's a journalist who was stationed in Russia. He was the first American journalist who was expelled from Russia since the Cold War because of his own efforts to investigate a government conspiracy there. And he makes a lot of very interesting points just about the nature of foreign bureaus as they operate in other countries. And it's obvious, but it's not something that we think about. We trust the media to get to the bottom of things. If there's something really going on, if there's a conspiracy, someone's going to be able to dig that up, or someone's going to be able to uncover that. But the reality is that that's not the nature of the media business, and it is a business. And for us as consumers, we consume the news because we're looking for an ongoing, steady stream of information. And so anything from the Bureau's perspective that is complicated, that involves a lot of risk, a lot of in-depth research and critical thinking, but at the same time could jeopardize the ongoing business operations in that country, it's not a very compelling business case. You're potentially jeopardizing the reason for the existence of that bureau for the pursuit of one individual story. And that doesn't mean that a lot of journalists aren't courageous. I think if you look at the Falun Gong story, even and the risks that journalists took and the people we spoke with, like Lisa Weaver, these people were involved in police chases just to cover and capture footage of protests in Tiananmen Square before. It's not that these people were without courage or conviction, but there's a combination of things. So like I said, there's the definite financial pressure and risks. There's the fact that these media operations, they're not set up to uncover one complicated, in-depth story as much as they are, to provide a steady stream of information over a long period of time. And then I think the other thing is the impact that propaganda has. And I touched on this a little bit earlier, but just the prospect that this story might be true completely evaporated the sympathy that you would have seen in the Western press for Falun Gong. And in that regard, I think one of the discoveries for me that was really eye-opening is that propaganda doesn't need to be foolproof and it doesn't need to be irrefutable. It just needs to muddy the waters so that people aren't going to want to stick their necks out to get to the bottom of it. And I think that definitely played a part in dissuading journalists from pursuing this story.
Well, how did the immolation change the conversation about Falun Gong?
Well, I mean, you'll see a little bit of that in the film when we speak with Lisa, because she's quite transparent. As I mentioned, she's someone who was evading arrest in order to smuggle out footage of previous protests. And then, and interestingly, it was exactly a year before the self-immolation incident that there was another protest on New Year's Eve in Tiananmen Square, and it had captured a lot of Western press attention. And actually, Lisa was part of that, and they had got the footage out and they had put it on the air. And the Chinese authorities were very upset about that. They had called up her bureau. She had been, there's some pressure applied there. And so she's back looking for another Falun Gong protest, a year later on Chinese New Year's Eve. And so when you're going to look for a Falun Gong protest and you see people who are claimed to be Falun Gong people, from a distance, it looks like they're doing something reminiscent of Falun Gong exercises. I could understand how people would think that that's what they saw. And then at the same time, you're dealing with people who sympathized with Falun Gong on a human rights angle, but still didn't understand the group very well. I believe. I think it was still a foreign practice to many people, even people who were stationed there. And at the same time, there's these very troubling images, and the participants themselves, in short order, are saying that they were led by Falun Gong to do this. So it would really take a lot of conviction and to be very strongly convinced that you had an alternative narrative in order to be willing to stick your neck out and say this wasn't the case. So I think a lot of people went along with it, and even if they didn't fully believe it, and I think that's what you see when you sit down in these interviews, well, it definitely wasn't representative of the Falun Gong that they had seen. That's definitely the case. But on some level, it's still like, well, maybe this group was behind it. And if they were, then I wasn't really going to stick my neck out to look further. So again, it gets back to that point of it's enough to, if you muddy the waters, it's enough to not pursue it further. And then what you find is that it really helps the Chinese government to change the narrative, not just in the media, where at the time, look, they were trying to get into the WTO right at this time. They're trying to land the Olympics. I mean, it's weeks later that the IOC is supposed to come and visit Beijing to determine whether they will get the 2008 Olympics. So you've changed the narrative from Falun Gong being repressed, the spiritual group, meditators being persecuted. You flip the narrative to some dangerous cult that the government needs to control. And that completely changes how people outside of China look at this issue and how much sympathy Falun Gong is worthy of.
Well, I know you're Canadian, but why should Americans care about this movie?
It's interesting, right? Because we made the film for the reasons that we made it. And then just as we were finishing the film, I realized as we Slam Dance is where we did our premiere in January in Park City. And it's the first festival we had submitted to, and the film wasn't even quite finished yet. But the immediate response we started receiving was, wow, this is very timely because of what we see happening in Hong Kong. And it's very timely with what we see is happening with the Uyghurs in northwest China, where, they're in internment camps and they're being forced to give up their beliefs. And in both cases, we see the government pushing a narrative that is very suspect and is obviously trying to rile the mainland Chinese population against these groups, whether that's in Hong Kong or whether that's with the Uyghurs or others. And I think what we recognized is that the issues that are beneath this story with the self-immolation and Falun Gong are unfortunately extremely topical because the very same things are at play with what's happening now. And then continue forward, a couple months later, and then all of a sudden we have, the outbreak of the coronavirus. in Wuhan and the censorship that happens around that, the reprimanding of journalists and whistleblowers. And it's almost as though they're going point by point with the themes that are in this film. And so I do think that even though this story is one that's 20 years, it's now approaching 20 years old, 20 years ago that this happened, the reality is that the impact of this event is still being felt today, and the tactics are still being employed. So I do believe that this film can give us a really unique insight for the challenges that we face in dealing with China in terms of getting to the truth about the tactics that are used to dissuade and to, basically to evade any kind of criticism or second guessing of any of their narratives. I think it can give us a lot of insight that is useful in terms of how we look at and deal with China today, which is obviously a very important subject.
Well, congratulations on making a fantastic documentary, and thanks for taking the time today to join me.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it.
And thank you for watching. Ask No Questions is currently on pre-order on Apple TV in North America. We'll have a link to it in the description below. The film hits all major video-on-demand platforms in North America on June 30th. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.